Black diner owner and her loyal dog save wildlife from rapids. The water roared like an angry beast, churning and foaming as it crashed over the rocks. Eleanor Jenkins, her 63-year-old frame soaked to the bone, clung desperately to a fallen tree that stretched halfway across the rapids. The rain had turned gentle now, but the damage was done. The river had swollen beyond recognition, transforming from a peaceful stream into a monster that threatened to devour everything in its path. "Hold on, Jasper," Eleanor screamed over the thunderous water. Her faithful German shepherd whimpered from the shore, his dark eyes fixed on his owner with unwavering loyalty. Between Eleanor and the safety of the riverbank, a terrified fawn trembled on a small outcropping of rock, its spindly legs quivering as the water rose inch by inch around it. 20 feet away, Richard Holloway, the property developer who'd spent months trying to buy Eleanor's diner, now stood frozen in disbelief. His expensive suit was ruined, plastered against his tall frame, his silver hair matted to his head. "The dam's going to break any minute," he shouted, his voice barely audible above the raging current. "Eleanor, forget the deer, you'll drown." Eleanor's weathered face hardened with determination. Her restaurant, Sweet Eleanor's, the heart of Millfield for 37 years, might be gone tomorrow if the flooding didn't subside. But right now, all that mattered was saving this innocent creature caught in humanity's mistakes. "I'm not leaving without this baby," she called back, inching forward along the log. Jasper barked frantically from the shore, sensing the danger as the wood beneath Eleanor's fingers began to splinter. The fawn let out a pitiful cry as water splashed over its back. Just then, a tremendous crack echoed through the valley. Upstream, the temporary dam that Richard's construction company had built was beginning to fail. "Eleanor," Richard's face drained of color, "we have seconds, not minutes. But let's go back to how this all started. It was just 3 hours earlier when the skies over Millfield were merely threatening rain, and Eleanor Jenkins was doing what she'd done nearly every morning since 1987, preparing to open her diner for the day. Eleanor wiped down the gleaming countertop of Sweet Eleanor's diner for the 3rd time that morning. The worn cloth moved in practiced circles over the surface she'd maintained religiously since inheriting the place from her father. Outside, dark clouds gathered over the small town of Millfield, promising a heavy spring rainfall. "What do you think, Jasper? Going to be a slow one today?" She glanced down at the German shepherd lying contentedly beside the counter. His graying muzzle lifted at the sound of his name, and his tail thumped rhythmically against the black and white checkered floor. The diner was empty now, but soon the morning regulars would filter in, seeking coffee and conversation as much as her famous blueberry pancakes. Sweet Eleanor's wasn't just a restaurant. It was a Millfield institution, a community gathering place where the town's history lived in every booth and barstool. Eleanor's hands, strong despite the arthritis that had settled into her joints over the years, arranged the salt and pepper shakers with precision. At 63, she moved more deliberately than she once had, but there was still grace in her movements, a confidence born of decades doing the same tasks with care. The bell above the door jingled, and Eleanor looked up to see Martha Gaines shuffling in, right on schedule. Martha had been coming to the diner for her morning coffee since before Eleanor took over from her daddy, back when Martha's husband was still alive, and they would share breakfast together before he headed to the factory. "Morning, Eleanor," Martha called, settling into her usual booth by the window. "Looks like we're in for some weather." "Morning, Martha." Eleanor poured coffee into a mug without asking. "Cream and sugar, you know it. That dog of yours looks more comfortable than I feel today." Martha nodded toward Jasper. "My joints are telling me this storm's going to be a doozy." Eleanor placed the coffee in front of her friend. "Mine too. Radio says we might get 3 inches before nightfall." Martha took a sip and sighed contentedly. "Any more news on that developer fellow, the one who's been sniffing around your property?" Eleanor's expression hardened slightly. "Richard Holloway came by again yesterday with another offer." She shook her head. "Higher than the last one, but still not interested. Can't blame him for trying. This location's prime real estate now that they're putting in that fancy shopping center across the river." Martha gazed out the window at the gathering storm clouds. "I can't imagine Millfield without Sweet Eleanor's. Won't happen while I'm still breathing," Eleanor said firmly, turning as the bell jingled again. 2 more regulars entered, Joe Patterson, the retired high school principal, and his brother Sam, who'd served in Vietnam alongside Eleanor's late husband, Michael. The Jenkins and Patterson families had been intertwined for generations. "Ladies," Joe nodded, removing his hat. "Smells like heaven in here, Eleanor. Just the usual cinnamon rolls. Take a seat and I'll bring you both some coffee." As Eleanor turned toward the kitchen, Jasper suddenly lifted his head, ears perked forward. A sleek black car had pulled into the parking lot, its tires crunching on the gravel. Eleanor recognized it immediately, and her shoulders tensed. "Looks like your admirer is back," Martha murmured. Richard Holloway stepped out of the car, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Eleanor made in a month. At 68, he carried himself with the confidence of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. He paused to look up at the sky before ducking into the diner, a leather portfolio tucked under his arm. "Ms. Jenkins," he nodded politely, his voice carrying the refined accent of someone who'd left Millfield for the big city decades ago but never quite lost the southern cadence. "Might I have a moment of your time?" Eleanor's expression remained neutral. "Mr. Holloway, coffee?" "Please." She poured him a cup, aware of the sudden quiet that had fallen over the diner. Everyone knew who Richard Holloway was, the local boy who'd made good in real estate development and returned to transform his hometown. Some viewed him as Millfield's potential savior, bringing jobs and progress. Others, like Eleanor, were more skeptical of the changes his vision would bring. "If you're here about buying my place, I'll save you the trouble. The answer's still no." Eleanor set the coffee down in front of him. Richard smiled, undeterred. "Actually, I came to discuss the weather. May I?" He gestured to a booth away from the other customers. Curiosity got the better of Eleanor. She nodded to Martha, who was watching with undisguised interest, and followed Richard to the corner booth. Jasper trailed behind, settling protectively at Eleanor's feet. "I'm concerned about the construction site upriver," Richard said once they were seated, his voice low. "The forecast has changed overnight. They're now predicting up to 5 inches of rain, possibly more." Eleanor frowned. "Your point. The temporary dam we've constructed, it's not designed for that kind of rainfall." Richard leaned forward. "The river could rise significantly, and your diner is in the potential flood path." "This building has weathered every flood since 1953, Eleanor replied, though a flicker of concern crossed her face. "My daddy built it to last. Things are different now. The river's course has shifted since they put in the highway bridge in '92, and our construction has altered the natural flow further." Richard opened his portfolio and spread out a map. "If the dam were to fail, the water would hit this bend, then funnel directly toward your property." Eleanor studied the map, her concern deepening. Sweet Eleanor sat closer to the river than most of Millfield's businesses, on land that had been in her family for generations. It was one of the reasons the view was so spectacular, and one of the reasons Richard wanted it so badly for his development. "So you're warning me out of the goodness of your heart?" Eleanor asked skeptically. Richard sighed. "Believe it or not, I don't want to see your place destroyed, Eleanor. Whatever our differences, I respect what this diner means to the community." He hesitated. "I'd like to offer you temporary relocation assistance. Just until the storm passes and we can assess any damage. And if I accept your help, you think I'll be more amenable to selling afterward?" Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "This isn't about the sale." Richard met her gaze steadily. "This is about safety. Yours, your customers, even that loyal companion of yours." He nodded toward Jasper. Before Eleanor could respond, the diner's door flew open. A young woman in a park ranger uniform burst in, her brown hair plastered to her face from the rain that had begun to fall. "Ms. Jenkins," she called urgently. "We need your help." Eleanor recognized Lisa Chen, a wildlife biologist who worked at the state park that bordered Millfield. Though only in her 30s, Lisa had earned respect in the community for her dedication to the local ecosystem, particularly the white-tailed deer population that had been struggling since construction began on Richard's development. "Lisa, what's happened?" Eleanor rose from the booth. "The storm's pushing the deer herd out of the high ground," Lisa explained breathlessly. "They're moving toward the river, right into the construction zone. We're trying to redirect them, but we're short-handed with the weather." Richard stood as well, his expression concerned. "How many?" "At least 20, including fawns born this spring," Lisa replied, glancing at him with barely concealed frustration. It was no secret she opposed his development project on environmental grounds. "Your security won't let us onto the property to help guide them away from the dam." Richard pulled out his phone. "I'll take care of that right now." "I'm coming with you," Eleanor decided, already untying her apron. "Eleanor, this isn't necessary," Richard began. "It's my town too, Richard." Eleanor's tone brooked no argument. "Martha, can you watch the diner? Joe, call around, see if anyone else can help the rangers." Martha nodded. "Go on, we'll hold down the fort." Eleanor grabbed her rain jacket from behind the counter. "Jasper, come." The dog was instantly at her side, alert and ready. "You're bringing your dog?" Richard looked dubious. "Jasper was Michael's service dog after he came back from Desert Storm. He's trained better than most people." Eleanor patted the shepherd's head. "He can help track the deer if they scatter." Outside, the rain was falling steadily now, drumming on the diner's metal roof. Eleanor, Richard, and Lisa hurried to Lisa's park service truck. "My team's already at the north end of the construction site," Lisa explained as they climbed in, Jasper jumping into the back seat. "The deer are moving southeast, which will take them right toward the dam if we can't divert them." As they drove through the increasing downpour, Eleanor looked out at the familiar landscape being transformed by the rain. Fields were already beginning to flood, and the normally gentle creek that fed into the river was swelling beyond its banks. "How stable is that dam of yours really, Richard?" she asked quietly. Richard's silence spoke volumes. Lisa drove them to the edge of the construction site, where the natural woodland gave way to churned earth and half-completed structures. The centerpiece of Richard's development was to be a luxury resort overlooking the river, with high-end retail shops and restaurants, direct competition for businesses like Eleanor's Diner. They parked beside several other vehicles, park service trucks, and the mud-splattered SUVs of volunteers. A small group of people in rain gear stood at the tree line, peering into the woods. "Lisa, over here," a man waved them over. "That's Marcus, my deputy," Lisa explained as they splashed through puddles to join the group. Marcus, a bearded man in his 40s, nodded to Eleanor and gave Richard a cool look. "The herd's about half a mile in, moving this way. We've got people stationed along the perimeter, but they're spooked by the water rising in their usual shelter areas." "My security team?" Richard asked. "They've opened the gates, but they're staying with the equipment," Marcus replied. "Can't blame them, that's their job." Lisa pulled out a map of the area. "We need to guide them away from the river, toward the eastern ridge. There's higher ground there where they'll be safe until the storm passes." Eleanor studied the map, noting the position of the temporary dam that Richard's company had constructed to facilitate their building work. Crossed the river just north of a sharp bend, creating a small reservoir that diverted water away from the active construction. "If that dam fails," she began. "It won't," Richard said firmly, but his eyes betrayed his concern. "It's designed to handle normal spring flooding." "This isn't normal," Lisa pointed out, gesturing to the intensifying rainfall. "The forecast keeps getting worse." A crack of thunder emphasized her point, and Jasper pressed against Eleanor's leg, sensing the tension. "We don't have time to argue," Eleanor decided. "What's the plan, Lisa?" "We form a loose line and move slowly through the woods, encouraging the deer away from the river and toward the ridge. No sudden movements, no loud noises unless absolutely necessary." Lisa looked at Jasper. "Will he stay calm around the deer?" "He will," Eleanor assured her. "Michael used to take him hunting, but he was trained to track, not chase." They divided into teams, with Eleanor, Richard, and Jasper joining Lisa to approach from the south. As they entered the woods, the canopy provided some shelter from the rain, but the ground was already becoming treacherous, leaves and pine needles turning slick underfoot. Richard, despite his expensive shoes and suit, kept pace with Eleanor, occasionally offering a steadying hand when the terrain grew difficult. There was an unexpected competence to him that surprised her. This wasn't just a businessman playing at being outdoorsy. "You seem comfortable in these woods," she observed quietly as they followed Lisa deeper into the forest. "I grew up here, remember?" Richard replied. "Before I was a developer, I was just a Millfield boy who spent every summer exploring these same trails." A nostalgic smile briefly crossed his face. "My father worked at the paper mill. We lived in that little blue house on Maple Street. The Holloways," Eleanor nodded, memories surfacing. "Your mother made those incredible apple pies for the fall festival." "Best in the county," Richard agreed. "She always said your father's diner was the only place that served pie that could compete with hers." The conversation ceased as Lisa held up a hand for silence. Through the trees ahead, they could see movement, the deer herd, moving nervously through the underbrush. Jasper went still beside Eleanor, his training taking over as he watched the animals without making a sound. Lisa motioned for them to spread out, forming a loose semicircle behind the herd. The plan was to create gentle pressure that would guide the deer away from the river without panicking them into a dangerous run. For nearly an hour, they moved slowly through the forest, the delicate ballet of humans and wildlife playing out in near silence except for the drumming of rain and occasional distant thunder. The deer seemed to be responding, gradually turning eastward toward the ridge. Eleanor felt an unexpected sense of purpose in this work, so different from her daily routine at the diner, yet somehow connected to it. Both were about care, about preserving something valuable. She glanced at Richard, wondering if he felt any conflict between this rescue effort and the development that had disrupted the deer's habitat in the first place. Then everything changed in an instant. A deafening crack split the air, not thunder, but the sound of something massive giving way. The ground beneath their feet trembled. "The dam!" Richard's face went pale. "We need to get to higher ground now." Lisa's radio crackled to life, the voice on the other end nearly unintelligible through static and the roar of water. "Breach flash, flood, evacuate immediately." The deer, startled by the noise, bolted not toward the safety of the ridge, but back toward the river and the construction site. A young fawn, separated from its mother in the panic, froze in place, trembling. "The herd!" Lisa cried, already running after them. "They're heading straight for the flood path." Eleanor looked at the terrified fawn, then at Richard. "You go with Lisa, I'll get this little one to safety." "Eleanor, it's too dangerous to split up, no time to argue," she cut him off. "Jasper and I can handle one fawn, go." After a moment's hesitation, Richard nodded and took off after Lisa. Eleanor turned to the frightened deer, speaking in the same gentle tone she used to calm Jasper during thunderstorms. "It's all right, little one. We're going to get you somewhere safe." With Jasper's help, she managed to approach the fawn without frightening it further. The dog, seeming to understand the gravity of the situation, stayed perfectly calm, helping to herd the young deer away from danger. They had made it perhaps a quarter-mile toward the ridge when the sound of rushing water grew louder. Eleanor looked back to see a wall of brown water surging through the trees behind them, carrying debris and uprooted vegetation in its churning path. "Run!" she urged the fawn, but the young deer was exhausted and confused. Without thinking, Eleanor scooped it up, staggering slightly under the weight. "Jasper, Ridge, go!" The shepherd led the way, finding the clearest path through the underbrush as Eleanor followed with her precious cargo. Her arms ached and her breath came in gasps, but she pressed on, the animal's heart racing against her chest. They reached the base of the ridge just as the water caught up with them. Eleanor felt it swirl around her ankles, then quickly rise to her knees, threatening to knock her off balance. With a final surge of strength, she made it to higher ground, setting the fawn down on a flat rock above the water line. "Good boy, Jasper," she panted, reaching down to scratch the dog's ears as he stood vigilantly beside her. "Now we need to find the others." But as the floodwaters continued to rise, cutting off their path forward and back, Eleanor realized they were effectively stranded. The ridge provided safety from the immediate flood, but they were now isolated on what had become a small island in a sea of churning water. Eleanor pulled out her phone, but there was no signal. The rain continued to fall in sheets, and she could only hope that Richard, Lisa, and the rest of the rescue team had made it to safety. More importantly, she wondered about her diner and the people of Millfield. Was the town being flooded too? As if in answer to her unspoken question, the roar of an engine cut through the sound of the rain and rushing water. Looking up, Eleanor spotted a small aluminum boat pushing through the current toward them. Richard Holloway stood in the bow, using a long pole to guide the craft through the debris-filled water. "Eleanor!" he shouted when he spotted her. "Hold on, we're coming." Beside him, Lisa Chen worked the boat's small outboard motor, skillfully navigating the treacherous current. Eleanor had never been so glad to see anyone in her life. "Over here," she called back, waving her arms. Jasper barked, adding his voice to hers. The fawn, still trembling but calmer now, stayed close to Eleanor as if sensing she was its protector. It would take all of Richard and Lisa's skill to get the boat close enough for a rescue without frightening the deer back into the floodwaters. As they maneuvered closer, Eleanor could see that Richard was soaked to the skin, his expensive suit ruined, a cut on his forehead dripping blood that mixed with the rain on his face. Yet there was a determined set to his jaw that reminded Eleanor of the boy she'd known decades ago, before ambition and success had taken him away from Millfield. "Can you make it down to that fallen tree?" he called, pointing to where a large pine had toppled, creating a natural bridge that extended partway into the water. "We can't get any closer with the boat," Eleanor assessed the situation. The tree seemed stable, wedged against the rocky outcropping where they had taken refuge, but reaching it would mean coaxing the frightened fawn down the slippery slope. "I'll try," she called back. "Jasper, stay." The dog whined but obeyed, watching anxiously as Eleanor slowly guided the fawn down toward the fallen tree. The young deer was reluctant, but with gentle persistence, Eleanor managed to get it moving in the right direction. Just as they reached the tree, a surge of water hit the boat, pushing it several feet away from the makeshift bridge. Lisa fought with the motor, trying to hold their position against the powerful current. "Eleanor, wait," Richard shouted. "It's not safe." But Eleanor had already started out onto the tree trunk, one hand steadying herself on the rough bark, the other guiding the fawn. They were about halfway across when the world seemed to tilt. The tree, its roots weakened by the floodwaters, shifted beneath them. "Jump!" Richard's voice cut through the roar of the water. Eleanor hesitated for a split second, not for her own safety, but concerned for the fawn. That moment of indecision proved costly. The tree gave way with a sickening crack, plunging both Eleanor and the young deer into the churning water. The cold hit her like a physical blow, driving the air from her lungs. Eleanor surfaced, gasping, to see the fawn struggling nearby, its head barely above water. Without thinking, she struck out toward it, fighting against the current that threatened to sweep them both downstream. From the shore, Jasper barked frantically, then plunged into the water despite Eleanor's earlier command to stay. The German shepherd's powerful swimming brought him quickly to Eleanor's side, and with an instinct born of years of training and companionship, he helped her reach the panicked fawn. Richard and Lisa maneuvered the boat through the debris, trying to reach them. Eleanor could see the fear and determination on Richard's face as he leaned dangerously far over the side, extending the pole toward her. "Grab on!" he shouted above the roar of the water. Eleanor managed to grasp the pole with one hand while holding onto the fawn with the other. Jasper swam alongside, helping to keep them afloat as Richard and Lisa slowly pulled them toward the boat. With a tremendous effort, Richard hauled Eleanor and the fawn aboard, then reached back to help Jasper scramble over the side. The boat rocked dangerously under the sudden weight, water sloshing over the gunwales. "Are you all right?" Richard's hands were gentle as he helped Eleanor to a sitting position, wrapping an emergency blanket around her shoulders. Eleanor nodded, too exhausted to speak, her attention on the fawn that lay trembling in the bottom of the boat. To her relief, the young deer was breathing steadily, apparently unharmed despite the ordeal. "The dam completely failed," Lisa explained as she guided the boat toward the nearest high ground. "The entire construction site is underwater. We managed to direct most of the herd to safety on the eastern ridge, but we lost track of you and this little one." "What about the town?" Eleanor asked, finding her voice at last. "Sweet Eleanor's." Richard and Lisa exchanged a look that made Eleanor's heart sink. "We don't know yet," Richard admitted. "Emergency services are focusing on evacuating the low-lying areas. Your diner is right in the potential flood path." Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, the weight of potential loss settling on her shoulders alongside physical exhaustion. Sweet Eleanor's wasn't just a building or a business. It was her father's legacy, her life's work, the heart of her community. "We need to get back," she said, struggling to rise despite her waterlogged clothes and aching muscles. "Eleanor, you need medical attention," Richard protested. "You nearly drowned." "I'm fine," she fixed him with a determined stare. "That diner is all I have, Richard. I need to see it." Something in her expression must have convinced him, for after a moment he nodded. "All right, but the fawn comes with us to the wildlife center first. It needs care too." They reached the shore where several emergency vehicles had gathered. Park rangers took charge of the exhausted fawn, promising to reunite it with the herd once the waters receded. A paramedic tried to insist that Eleanor go to the hospital, but she adamantly refused. "Just give me a minute to catch my breath," she told Richard, leaning against a tree with Jasper pressed protectively against her legs. The rain had finally begun to ease, though the sky remained ominously dark. Richard handed her a bottle of water. "You're the most stubborn woman I've ever met, Eleanor Jenkins." A small smile tugged at her lips despite everything. "So my husband used to tell me. Michael was a good man." Richard's voice softened with genuine respect. "He would have been proud of what you did today." The unexpected kindness brought tears to Eleanor's eyes, but she blinked them away quickly. "Let's get to town." They found Richard's driver waiting with his SUV at the edge of the disaster area. As they made their way toward Millfield, the extent of the flooding became clear. Fields had become lakes, roads were underwater, and rescue boats were bringing stranded residents to safety. Eleanor's heart pounded painfully as they approached the stretch of Riverside Road where Sweet Eleanor's had stood since 1953. The diner occupied a small peninsula that jutted into the river, a location that had provided beautiful views for decades, but now put it directly in harm's way. As they rounded the final curve, Eleanor gasped. The road ahead was submerged, water flowing across it in a swift current. Beyond where Sweet Eleanor's should have been, she could see only swirling brown water. "No," she whispered, a single word laden with decades of memories and meaning. Richard placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch unexpectedly gentle. "I'm sorry, Eleanor." But as the driver pulled to a stop at the edge of the floodwater, Eleanor noticed something strange. The water level around where the diner should be didn't look right. It was too low, given the flooding everywhere else. "Wait," she said, leaning forward. "Something's not right." As they watched, a figure in a yellow raincoat appeared, waving frantically from what appeared to be an island in the middle of the flood. "That's Martha," Eleanor exclaimed, recognizing her friend. "But how?" "The foundation," Richard breathed, sudden understanding in his voice. Your father built it on that natural rock outcropping. It's higher than the surrounding land. Hope surged through Eleanor as they peered through the rain. Now she could make out the shape of her diner, still standing on its sturdy foundation, though surrounded by water on all sides. The building had become an island in the flood, and from what she could see, it appeared largely intact. We need to get across, Eleanor decided, already opening the car door. Eleanor, wait, Richard caught her arm. It's still dangerous. That current could sweep a person away in seconds. Martha's over there, and probably others. Eleanor's tone made it clear this wasn't up for debate. I'm going. Richard sighed, then nodded. Not alone, you're not. They were saved from attempting a dangerous crossing when a fire department rescue boat approached the shore. The firefighters initially refused to take them to the diner, insisting their priority was evacuating people to safety, not the other way around. There are people sheltering in that building, Eleanor argued. I'm the owner. I need to make sure they're all right. After some discussion, the fire chief relented, perhaps recognizing that Eleanor would attempt the crossing with or without their help. Richard insisted on accompanying her, while Jasper, exhausted from his earlier swim, remained in the SUV with Richard's driver. The short boat ride revealed the true extent of the flooding. What had once been a parking lot was now several feet underwater. The river had reclaimed land that had been dry for generations, and the current tugged strongly at the rescue boat as they approached the diner. Yet sweet Eleanor's stood firm, its cinder block foundation anchoring it to the bedrock below. Water lapped at the front steps, but the main floor remained above the flood line. Through the windows, Eleanor could see movement. People had indeed taken shelter inside. Martha burst through the door as they docked at the steps, her face lighting up with relief. Eleanor Jenkins. Don't you ever scare me like that again? Eleanor embraced her friend tightly. What happened here? When the evacuation order came, some folks couldn't get out in time, Martha explained, leading them inside. The water rose so fast, we ended up with quite a crowd taking refuge. The diner had been transformed into an impromptu shelter. At least 20 people occupied the booths and tables, many wrapped in tablecloths or spare linens from the storage room. Joe Patterson was organizing the distribution of food from the kitchen, while his brother Sam had rigged up a hand-crank radio to monitor emergency broadcasts. Been giving folks coffee and whatever food we could prepare, Martha continued. The gas stove still works, thank the Lord, even if the electricity's gone. Eleanor moved through the diner, checking on each person, offering words of comfort and reassurance. These were her neighbors, her customers, her friends, the people who had supported sweet Eleanor's through good times and bad. Richard stood quietly by the door, observing the scene with an unreadable expression. When Eleanor finally made her way back to him, he spoke softly so only she could hear. I've been trying to buy this place for months because I saw its value as real estate. I never fully understood its true worth until today. Eleanor studied his face, seeing genuine emotion where she had expected to find only calculation. This diner isn't just a building, Richard. It's a part of what makes Millfield a community. I'm beginning to see that. He hesitated, then continued. When the waters recede, there will be damage to repair. Let me help. Eleanor's instinct was to refuse. She had been standing on her own 2 feet for decades and didn't need a wealthy developer's charity. But as she looked around at the people sheltering in her diner, she recognized that pride had no place in recovery. Millfield would need all the help it could get to rebuild. We'll talk about it, she conceded, but not as a prelude to selling. Fair enough. Richard offered his hand, and after a moment, Eleanor shook it. As the afternoon wore on, the rain finally stopped. Reports came in via emergency radio that the flood had crested and waters were beginning to recede. Sweet Eleanor's would remain an island for another day or two, but the worst had passed. By evening, Eleanor found herself sitting in a booth by the window, watching the sunset break through the clouds, painting the floodwaters in shades of gold and crimson. Richard sat across from her, both of them nursing cups of coffee that Martha had somehow made perfect despite the challenging circumstances. I've been thinking, Richard said after a comfortable silence, about the development project. Eleanor tensed slightly, preparing for another sales pitch. I'm going to redesign it, he continued, surprising her. Scale it back, work with Lisa Chen and her team to create something that respects the natural environment and the town's character. What brought this on? Eleanor asked, genuinely curious. Richard gazed out at the flooded landscape. Today I watched a 63-year-old diner owner risk her life to save a fawn while my fancy dam washed away like it was made of cardboard. He shook his head. It's made me reconsider what kind of legacy I want to leave in Millfield. Eleanor felt something shift between them, not friendship exactly, not yet, but a mutual respect that hadn't existed before. Besides, Richard added with a hint of his businessman's pragmatism. After today's disaster, we'll need to rebuild public trust. A more environmentally sound approach might help with that. Eleanor laughed softly. There's the Richard Holloway I know. He smiled in return, the expression transforming his face, making him look younger. Some things don't change, but others can. The next morning dawned clear and bright. Eleanor stood on the front steps of Sweet Eleanor's, Jasper at her side, surveying the changed landscape. The floodwaters were noticeably lower, revealing glimpses of the parking lot and road. Lisa Chen arrived by boat shortly after sunrise, bringing news that the fawn had been successfully reunited with its mother and the rest of the herd. The wildlife biologist looked exhausted but satisfied. We're already documenting the flood's impact on the local ecosystem, she told Eleanor and Richard as they stood together outside the diner. It's not all negative, surprisingly. Some of the wetland areas that had been drying up have been revitalized. Nature has a way of restoring balance, Eleanor observed. Sometimes with a little help, Lisa added, glancing meaningfully at Eleanor. Richard cleared his throat. Ms. Chen, when you have a moment, I'd like to discuss some revisions to our development plans. I think you'll find the new approach more aligned with your conservation goals. Lisa's eyebrows rose in surprise, but she nodded cautiously. I'd be interested to hear that. Inside the diner, Martha had somehow managed to prepare a full breakfast for everyone despite the limited resources. The mood was upbeat as people discussed plans for cleanup and recovery once the waters fully receded. Joe Patterson raised his coffee mug in a toast. To Sweet Eleanor's, still standing when everything else washed away. And to Eleanor, Richard added, who showed us what it really means to care for this town and everything in it. Eleanor felt her cheeks warm at the unexpected praise. I just did what anyone would have done. No, Martha contradicted gently. Not anyone would have gone into those rapids for a fawn. That was pure Eleanor Jenkins' stubbornness. The laughter that followed had a healing quality to it, the sound of a community beginning to recover from disaster, finding strength in connection and shared experience. As the days passed and the floodwaters retreated, Millfield began the long process of rebuilding. Sweet Eleanor's, having survived relatively unscathed, became a natural gathering place for volunteers, relief workers, and residents seeking a moment of normalcy amid the chaos. Eleanor found herself working alongside Richard more often than she would have expected. True to his word, he had revised his development plans, scaling back the commercial aspects and incorporating Lisa's suggestions for environmental restoration. He still wanted to build his resort, but now it would be designed to complement Millfield's existing character rather than overshadowing it. 1 month after the flood, Sweet Eleanor's held a special reopening celebration. The diner had been temporarily closed for minor repairs and a fresh coat of paint, but now it was ready to resume its role as the heart of the community. The parking lot was filled to capacity as people from all over Millfield gathered to celebrate not just the diner's survival, but the town's resilience. Martha had baked enough pies to feed an army, and Joe Patterson's barbecue grill sent mouth-watering aromas wafting through the air. Eleanor stood at the entrance, greeting friends and neighbors with Jasper faithfully at her side. The German Shepherd had become something of a local celebrity after his role in the fawn rescue, and children crowded around to pet him. Richard arrived late, having come directly from a meeting with town officials about the revised development project. He looked more relaxed than Eleanor had ever seen him, dressed in casual clothes rather than his usual suit. Quite a turnout, he observed, taking in the festive scene. People needed this, Eleanor replied. A chance to celebrate something going right. They walked together toward the riverbank where the waters had returned to their normal channel. The landscape bore the scars of the flood, uprooted trees, eroded banks, debris caught in branches, but already new growth was emerging from the mud. I got the final insurance assessment today, Eleanor said, breaking a comfortable silence. The foundation needs some work, but it's nothing that can't be fixed. I know some excellent contractors, Richard offered. People I trust to do quality work. I'd appreciate the recommendation. Eleanor paused, then added, You know, I've been thinking about something you said during the flood about my father building this place on solid rock. A wise man, Richard acknowledged. He used to say that it wasn't enough for a business to make money, it had to stand for something that would last. Eleanor gazed at her diner at the people gathered around it. I think that's what you were missing in your original plans, Richard. You were building on sand. Instead of taking offense, Richard nodded thoughtfully. And now you're starting to understand what Millfield is really about, she smiled slightly. It's not about fancy resorts or high-end shopping. It's about community, people looking out for each other when the waters rise. From the diner came the sound of laughter and music as someone started playing an old piano that had been donated after the flood. Martha appeared at the door, waving them back. Eleanor, Richard, we're about to cut the cake. As they turned to rejoin the celebration, Eleanor spotted something moving at the edge of the woods, a doe and a familiar fawn, watching curiously from the tree line. Jasper noticed them too, but remained calmly at Eleanor's side, seeming to understand that these particular deer were under his protection. Look, she said softly, pointing them out to Richard. He smiled, a genuine expression that reached his eyes. Seems like everyone came to your reopening. The doe and fawn lingered for a moment longer, then melted back into the forest as mother and child returned to their natural home. Eleanor took a deep breath of the spring air, feeling a profound sense of contentment despite the challenges that still lay ahead. Sweet Eleanor's had weathered the flood, just as it had weathered decades of change in Millfield. And now, with unlikely new allies and a strengthened community, its future seemed more secure than ever. Come on, she said to Richard and Jasper. Let's go have some cake. As they walked back to the diner together, Eleanor knew that while the physical foundation beneath Sweet Eleanor's was important, it was the less tangible foundation, the connections between people, the shared history, the mutual support in times of crisis that truly kept it standing. That was a lesson worth nearly drowning for, and one she wouldn't soon forget. If you're enjoying this story, please consider subscribing to hear more stories like this.